So this session, which is the third day of the Peralta Online Equity Conference, is being recorded, and I wanted you to know that. May adjust your participation or not, hope not. Second, I wanted to let you know that we have enabled live captioning on this feature, and on the lower bar of your Zoom screen, you'll see a little toggle that says CC, live transcript, and it will allow you to watch auto transcriptions. They are not perfect. After the session is over, we will have someone edit those transcripts, and then before the recording is made public, we'll improve them. So I also wanted to let you know that we have Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. If you're a social media person, we would enjoy participation on those. And once I'm done talking, I'll put the links in the chat. I also wanted to right away, and I will do this a number of times during the event, because when people join late, they don't see the chat that came before. I have just put in a link to the Peralta Online Equity Rubric, which will be one of the things Amy talks about today. And lastly, I will keep an eye on the chat. Amy may or may not be able to address questions in the chat as she's going, but I will answer questions there when I can. And if something comes up that's super important, I'll bring it to her attention. So with that, I will introduce you to Amy Bohorquez, who is both a beloved colleague of mine. She teaches in the biology department at Laney, and she is an equity team member on the Peralta Online Equity Team Initiative. So Amy, there you go.
Great. Thank you, Inger, and thank you, everyone. Right. Good morning. We were just joking because I'm not a huge morning person, so I look very put together here, but I admittedly have pajama pants on. So, right, this is how we do, right? So, one of the things I wanted to point out before I get into the slides is, yes, definitely feel free to put questions in the chat, and if something comes up, I'm fine with stopping and answering that question, and hopefully we'll have time for some questions and discussion at the end though as well. So if it's something you are okay with waiting to have answered, maybe just notate that. But let me share my screen with you. Okay, because I'm gonna do PowerPoint, so I might hide everyone here so I can kind of see. Okay, great. So as Inger mentioned, my name is Amy Bohorquez. I'm biology faculty at Laney College, as well as being a member of our online equity training team. I'm assuming that the thing in the chat right now is not for me, so I'm not going to look at it. But we are going to be talking a bit about making your online course relevant for STEM. And some of these tips may be somewhat STEM specific, but some of the concepts actually apply to both other courses online as well as our face-to-face environment. So today we're first going to talk about what I mean by relevance, because as a biologist, of course, I think everything I teach is relevant because people are biology and the world is biology. But if we've learned anything in the last year, it's that science needs to do a better job of relaying information to people that aren't scientists in ways that are understandable, that aren't condescending, that are open to discussion. We can do a better job of ensuring that our students feel like that information is relevant to them. So I'll talk a bit about some of the research on STEM success and some of the barriers that students find in college in general. Then we'll look at how to evaluate your course content, and we'll talk a bit about building community around equity. And like I said, hopefully we'll have some time at the end for question and answer. So the next thing I'm going to show is the Peralta rubric, which you've probably seen over the last few days. I do want to note that it is kind of bright. So if you're not up yet, this will definitely do it for you. So here is our grading, our rubric that we use to evaluate courses. There's a few I want to note here that relate to this idea of relevance. One is this content meaning, E7. So notice here under the elements like to be exemplary, what we're talking about is not only that students can connect to the course material, they see themselves in the material, but also being able to see other perspectives, right? And other backgrounds and other ways of connections. This also relates up to E5, which are images and representation, and particularly representation, because again, sometimes, and maybe you're starting off by just putting images of people in your Canvas shell or in your lecture notes or lecture slides, but how are we representing those different backgrounds, those different perspectives? And so we're doing that, which in the sciences sometimes also connects to E6, which is human bias. So as I mentioned, if you were in our Wednesday morning, there, of course, science has bias. Some of us were trained to think scientific method removes bias. I would argue that's not necessarily true. And I think I'm not alone in that one. So addressing it up front and how you can do that in the scientific environment, which also relates down to E4, our inclusion and diversity, looking to make sure that our class is inclusive of multiple ways of thinking, as well as representing people with diverse backgrounds and diverse in representation in positive ways. So I'm going to step back for a second, though, to talk a bit about why it's important that we support our STEM students. In 2019, there was a report published by the National Center for Education Statistics that looked at graduation rates and degree award rates. I'm going to use the language that they used in the study, which isn't necessarily language that I would use to represent these data, but what they were basically looking at is there has been an increase in college enrollment kind of across the board in many groups over the last 10 years or so. So they wanted to see if there were increases to the same degree, right, in degrees. And again, so I'm going to show you some of their statistics really quick. But again, this isn't necessarily language that I would have chosen to use. But what they looked at was particularly in STEM and engineering degrees of what they referred to as underrepresented minority groups. So they looked at women overall. They also looked at minority, quote unquote, groups of women and men, similar. And they looked also at people with disabilities. And I'm happy to share the link to this at the end because it is a really interesting report. And it's a report. They don't have suggestions on how to solve the problem. They were just looking. What I want to notice you to notice though about this chart, notice these percents are pretty small. So this is still, 0, 2, 4, right? So although this line here about bachelor's degree women and underrepresented minority groups does look like it's increasing, and it is for sure, it is increasing a few percent, right? So it's not like it's not as big as this may look because of the scale. And again, this is from 1996 to 2016. And you can see it starts to kind of, peter out as the time you get to the doctoral degrees. And that's partially what they saw was that a lot of students coming into college may choose a STEM pathway, but the number of students who earn the degree in it goes down. The number of students who go on to a master's program goes down, and then even more to a doctoral or into research fields or biology as a field or STEM, particularly engineering, but we can talk a bit about that too. So the question becomes, well, what are some of the techniques we can use to help to increase our retention of STEM students? And last year, there was a study published of undergraduate biology students at Columbia that looked at just this question of what were the components that led to students being successful, in particularly what in the sciences sometimes we still refer to as weed out classes, right? Which is an awful thing to have to begin with, but many of us survived these huge lectures that the intention is to kind of limit how many people pass or continue. Not the best plan to begin with, right? And what they found actually was that was the community that was built in the room or the network of students that was more important than a student's ability to learn the material. So how we build community in class is more important than the material that we're covering when we're looking at students successfully moving on to continue to stay in STEM. And this, I'm happy to also share the link. I shared the link to the New York Times coverage of this article in the program for the conference if you want. And it's a really fascinating thing. And I'll talk a bit about some of the things that they suggested from this study as we get into the course content. But there are some things we need to address, particularly in STEM, that may be what's leading students to feel not as welcome or unwelcome or unsupported in our classrooms. And so how do we make sure our students feel like they do belong? One of the things I think is really important as STEM faculty is that we recognize the importance of and the reality of stereotype threat. So I put a couple of references down here that I'm happy to share with you if you're interested, but Claude Steele's work is probably the area that's you may be most familiar with. And what I mean by stereotype threat, and maybe you've heard the term imposter syndrome, that we've talked about that for a while too. This feeling that although this is my interest, although I'm really enjoying it, I don't feel like I belong here. And often that is based on real life experience in classrooms, right? So teachers maybe not making me feel like I belong in the room. Teachers may be doing things, and it could be unintentional. So for instance, Jay Luke Wood, who's a faculty member at San Diego State University in math and runs kind of a equity training, you could say, program. He has compiled with his team research from a multitude of places that talks about these four kind of I almost said basic, that's not the word, for microaggressions that often students, particularly men of color, experience in classrooms. Like that question of like, oh, this is calculus too, or are you looking for a different class? Or the assumption that they play a sport, or the assumption that their behavior on campus, is somehow nefarious. And these are situations that, again, when you start coming into a room and you already don't feel welcome in the space, it's very difficult for students and for faculty to kind of overcome that initial feeling. When it happens to you over and over and over again, then there's this question of like, well, why am I staying in this field if this is an area I don't feel like I belong? The other thing I want to point out about stereotype threat that does relate to this previous article too, is that often what we found is, say, people who identify as female do better on math tests if they were allowed to use an alias, or frequently students who have to fill out demographic data on exams don't do as well if they're not a member of the dominant culture. So this kind of having to acknowledge, yeah, I'm different from everybody else, seems to also put students at a disadvantage in taking exams. So for instance, one of the things I started to try out is on my exams, I have them do a self-affirmation in the beginning, which was one of the recommendations of that previous study, where they get to share with me something that made them happy or something that made them smile. That's difficult right now, right? And then a lot of things are not that. But what I found was on the second test, my students were like, I was hoping you were going to ask this again because I saw this video and I think you would like it. And again, it just kind of puts you in a better space. There's a couple of articles about that too. So it's my major students. So I tell them I have the reference if they would like it, right? So still science. But one of the things that Jay Luke Wood recommends is he has these 5 Bs of equitable practices that include this being relevant one. And that's the one that I want to kind of focus on. I will note too that I sometimes struggle between being intrusive and this ascription of intelligence microaggression. So ensuring that my intrusiveness is not targeted or implying at all that students can't do the work, right? So, and I think that's one that can be hard for some of us to balance. Okay, but let's look at another way of looking at this in STEM in particular. And this has to go from helping students to shift their mindset from a fixed mindset. Again, and I experienced this myself as having professors that told me things like, oh, maybe you should do something you're better at. Just like, okay, it kind of gets in your head that maybe I'm not good at this, and maybe this is hard, and maybe I shouldn't be in this field. But encouraging our students to switch the way that they're thinking about things to what's considered a growth mindset, which is like, oh, well, how can I improve, right? So grading for what's right is often one way that we can do this, or having students work together to go over what's right. And I'll show you an example, a couple of slides on how one of the ways I try to do that. There is a bit of like Ronald Reagan, pull yourself up by your bootstraps mentality with some of the reading about the fixed versus growth mindset. And I want to clarify, I'm not saying that at all. I'm not saying students should just be able to change their mindset. I'm saying as you look at your class, think about ways that maybe you can encourage a growth mindset. Plus, this is science. So we are supposed to hypothesize and test and then get results and apply, right? So are there things we can try to do to see if it's helping? And here's a one, maybe just ask that, right? Like, let's ask our students more like, hey, did you find that that activity helped you to have more confidence in this material or not? And I would say too, it can also be quite class specific. And I'll talk a little bit more about that one as well. So on Wednesday, I had got the question from Kevin about how do I talk to other faculty about this, right? And is that a difficult conversation, and what are some tips? I can say too, a lot of what conversations I've had, people say like, well, what can I add into my module to make it, or class to make it more equitable? But if you're not familiar with the Society for Biological Education Research, or SABR, there's also been a number of great talks about equity in science and biology, but it can apply to more things. And from some of those, I'd actually suggest switching the question a bit to, instead of asking, what can I add? Maybe think of it as, what can you take out? Now, granted, a lot of us teach this very, European scientific revolution, Descartesian mechanistic view of science, which we can't take it all out, right? But addressing it might be a way to look at it. But being able to evaluate what's already in your class, maybe from a different perspective, is a one way to see what it is you're doing. And then maybe what can I take out, or what can I change, right? A lot of us, I think, have taken this last incredibly challenging year as a way to reevaluate the way we're teaching. And that's hard. I'm not saying it's easy by any means. And I wouldn't say try to take it all on at once, but maybe little bits at a time, like how do you start class? And again, what are you bringing in? So partially what I did is like, what am I bringing into the space? And are there ways that I can modify some of that, my own presence in the room, to be more equitable? I am also going to point out, if you read Nature or the news articles covering it, there was just a really interesting article in Nature looking at why is it that we always want to add stuff when we're solving problems instead of subtracting things. So, and that's the link at Adams. They were looking at our kind of propensity for systematically wanting to add stuff when we solve a problem, as opposed to taking stuff out. Now, granted, in chemistry or in cooking, we can't always take stuff out once we've put it in, but you can in Canvas, right? You can in your online class. So again, kind of taking from that perspective, which is going to lead me into this conversation about evaluating our courses and looking at content versus covering material. So Terry McGlynn, who I'm pretty sure is at Cal State Dominguez Hills, and I probably should have verified that before this morning, wrote a book about how to teach college, right, biology, and looking at it from this perspective of maybe taking some stuff out. But what the book focuses on, and he has a couple of essays, articles about this as well, is maybe changing how we address certain topics in our classes. Most of us in STEM in particular were taught from kind of what's referred to as a fire hose method, where it's just everything's thrown at you, you see what you remember. But he gives the example of a student he had that was this excellent student, got A's on everything. They finished the animal section, and the student comes up a couple weeks later and says, "Are spiders arthropods?" And his thought was like, how do you not know? Okay, I'm doing something wrong here. So what he concluded was that there were basically three things he wanted his students to get out of his ecology and evolution classes. So that evolution is complex. Most of the organisms that existed don't exist anymore. And most animals, including are arthropods. So this method of kind of, again, taking things out. I'm super lucky at Laney College to be working with some math faculty who are working with Cal State East Bay on what's referred to as proficiency, or previously called mastery grading, where you just have these like list of things you want students to learn. And then you give them multiple opportunities to demonstrate their knowledge. So Kathy Williamson, I don't know if she's in the room or not, but she's been working on this with Laney, and she gave a talk. I'll talk about our group in a second too, about how that's going. It sounds like a lot of work, but it sounds kind of amazing. And as a student who struggled in chem, I really wish I would have been able to go back and take that test over again, right? Like, oh, now I get it. So it also allows students some flexibility in their ability to show you this information. So, okay, now I'm going to look at a couple of kind of course specific or assignments, including how you can integrate in research. But as I do this, what I want to show you too is kind of how I do my Canvas page layouts. So this is an example of one of my article and video analysis, which admittedly, I just like that it looks like AVA just looks cool. So I'm a sucker for graphic design and fonts and things like that, as many of my colleagues know. But just in terms of layout, I do always have the purpose of the assignment. So this is in general why we read articles and watch videos. So I want my students to see that science and biology can be played in different formats. Presentations can be given in different ways. We can relate science in ways that are more accessible to folks. I also then have what I think are clear directions. I'll tell you how kind of feedback I get on these sometimes, one of my other assignments. And then I have a place where students can share their thoughts about this. So one of the things that when we look at teaching what could be considered painful pedagogy, that students experience is they're ending up like kind of reliving trauma associated to this or living in that trauma, and they don't have a place to express themselves. And in science, we often don't ask students how they feel about the material. So giving students a place, this is my majors class, so they have it in their discussions, but my non-majors, I just have an editable page in Canvas or Padlet or a Jamboard or something where people can do stuff anonymously. Is really important for students to feel like they have the ability to express themselves and it's welcome and without judgment, right? So it's not part of an assignment. I also will say too, what we learned this semester in trying this out was to kind of post some examples. So that idea, like nobody wants to cut into the cake, all right, but once it's cut into, then everyone will have some. So putting some examples of things that maybe you even experience from reading this article or articles like these, or ask other students. Again, it's anonymous, so you're not using names on it. This article too is about how class can reduce racism. So it's pretty relevant. It talks about genetics and genetic studies. If you want this article too, you can see this, Amy Harmon wrote this. Notice too, this is a PDF. So look, I have, right, I have to change my PDF still just to show we're not all perfect all the time, right? But one of the things I quite like about this particular article is that they use non-gender specific names in the scenario they present, which I think is great, even if they hyphenated right here, which I wish they would know. So this is one way to, again, my point being showing students different ways of talking about biology, also allowing them to express their feelings about it. So it is an assignment. It is a quiz and Canvas, and I'm happy to talk about why I do a lot of my assignments as a quiz versus other kinds of assignments. But I point out here, like it's not really a quiz, it's just the way that I've set it up. And it's got the questions have things about the way the information is presented and the presentation style of the article, right? And I'll show you another example that's an actual video. But the next one I want to talk about is an example of an assignment that I think would be cool to do, but haven't done the whole thing yet, is including other ways of knowing, right? And sometimes us in science, we have a bit of adversity to this idea, though I think there's a lot of folks who are like, well, maybe I do, and I just haven't said it at work yet, right? So I want to talk about a recent article that was published by Singer and Klemecki about looking at empathy versus compassion. I put the word karuna there because if you are familiar with the Buddhist Noble Truths or Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, you've seen that word before. And this idea of switching from empathy to compassion, because it tends to lead to more altruistic behaviors. Now, if you're like, where am I getting that from? This study actually looked at brain scans of people in both empathetic distress state as well as a compassionate state. And what they found, right, and I'm going to point this out one at a time. So if you're like, brains, don't worry. So here's, again, the locations of the empathy pain network. So what they found was that these areas highlighted or lit up in an MRI, you can see the brain scans here, and that the area that lit up when people were experiencing empathetic distress was the same as the people experiencing the pain. And often that's quite debilitating, right? And maybe many of us have felt this over the last year of like, oh, I don't know what to do. Or we see this a lot when we look at what's referred to as climate anxiety or eco anxiety versus eco resilience, right? Or eco compassion. Because what we find is when people experience compassion, what we see is it highlighting different parts of the brain. It also tends to, again, lead to more altruistic behaviors. And one of the things that was fascinating was that if the person experiencing the pain, right, that you were witnessing was in your in-group, the level of altruism was more. So that's a whole other thing that we can talk about. But what was also interesting about this research, so besides doing these brain scans and looking at this comparison, is they wanted to see if meditation could help to switch people's experiences from empathy to compassion. So here's where we go into this other ways of knowing and why I mentioned Buddhism and Patanjali Yoga Sutras, right? And it does show up in other places as well. So this is kind of looking at the compassion group, right? And the memory group with the training. When they say training here, they're talking about meditative training. So this was a group of folks who went through multiple meditation trainings. They compared meditative practitioners, people who've done this for a long time, with meditative naive folks to see if there was a way that you could switch from, again, empathy, particularly, again, empathetic distress, to a more compassionate neural pathway. And sure enough, yes, you can. So this is also a way to bring into your classes information that students may be practicing but might not want to talk to you about, right? So not to say, however, that science has to validate anyone's viewpoint. It's just including it into the class to kind of show, oh, look, this is what's happening in your brain during these situations. John Kabat-Zinn has done a lot of research on mindfulness, right? So if you'd rather do it from that perspective, a secular perspective, I can understand that as well. And same, there's brain scans and things you could include when you're teaching about the brain or teaching about behavior. But one of the other things I think this is really important to share with folks is because this also lends itself towards the idea of not appropriating someone else's struggle, right? So acknowledging someone else's struggle, being compassionate for them, but not necessarily with them, right? So acknowledging that experience belongs to that person, and having a pathway, showing it neurologically that this idea of compassion will lead us to more action for those of us who haven't experienced that actual thing. And you can apply that in many ways, especially again, over the last year, we can talk about that. But it's a way to kind of, again, bring in other ways of knowing into our science classes, and you can talk about it secularly or not. So I noticed there was some chats. Inger, is there anything that I should bring up before I look at other examples, or are these mainly things for the end?
I think mostly people are commenting appreciatively about what you're saying, and I'm putting things in the chat that give them links to some of the stuff you're talking about and clarifying. So keep going.
Excellent. Great. Cool. Right on. Because again, one of the things I really try to do in my classes is, and doing it here, trying to model, that I'm also happy to modify things, right, for our students as it comes up, or change the way we do some things just to see. And this is the area where I'll show you some of the ways that I've learned. I'm doing a lot of air quotes today. Sorry. I learned a lot of things in a way that I didn't expect. Okay. So let's talk about bias in science. So I'm going to show you an example from our general biology, our non-majors class. And again, I'm just going to go over a bit of the layout of the pages first. So you can see we tried to be very consistent in the way that we do the layout for these classes. Now, if you are familiar with discognitive theory stuff, there is something to having different fonts and things that helps people to think differently. But in classes like this one, we're not trying to do that yet, right? So we're trying to make this comfortable, reliable, you know, stable might be a good word. So we start off, this is the first page again, with why it is important that you take a biology class. And maybe now it's a little more obvious that we need to have better science education in schools, but that acknowledgement that we do have a certain degree of bias in science, right? In medicine, we can see it and we're going to talk about it. And we're also trying to say here, we're not adverse to this, right? Like we are welcome to answer your questions and we'll try to do the best that we can. Again, page layout wise, I'm going to point out too that what we have is the directions. So we have a step one. This is the lecture video. We give them a lecture notes workbook and things that they can have either digitally or on paper. I use my syllabus as kind of a learning hub. So it's lots of active links and things, though I do quite like some of the other options for how to do a syllabus. Debate about that one. But what you notice is this is Henrietta Lacks. And so we start off talking about her story. This is a situation, though, I want to point out that we were like, oh, yes, let's put this in here. And then thought, okay, but we don't want the representation for all African-American people in my class to be about exploitation of medicine and oppressive institutionalized systems. So is there a way we can balance this out, right? So that it's, again, that idea of representation. So what we included, so you see here's step two, some study questions. We have a practice quiz. Our students have a discussion area, and I'll show you what that looks like. We just included a short video about her if people weren't familiar with her. I quite also like this theory hypothesis wrap because this person has a Star Wars shirt and I'm a huge science fiction person, but we wanted to ensure that there was balance on the pages. And again, this is an example where we also provided a space for students to be able to share how they feel about the material in a way that was safe and without judgment. So we keep an eye on it. Often tell students too, they can post pictures or they can use different font colors, trying not to delete anyone else's thoughts. So again, I just use an editable Canvas page, but a Padlet or a Jamboard would do the same thing. The other examples that I want to show you that you can include in your classes are things like using other people, right? So maybe another way to ensure the representation in your class is in a positive light is by searching out or finding researchers that are already doing some of this work. So maybe you think, I don't really like my lecture on cellular respiration. Maybe there's someone that's doing it and I can use theirs instead. Or maybe you're just like, wow, I'm really tired of making video lectures right now. Maybe there's someone else, or maybe it's just a supplemental thing. So this is an example of another one of the ABA assignments. I actually used this one in both of my classes with slightly different questions. So again, I did notice it doesn't say purpose here, but similar layout. So again, trying to have consistency. This is Dr. Tyrone Hayes, who's at UC Berkeley. He studies the effects of pesticides on amphibians. I put a note here, a bit of a warning because I have a number of students like myself who aren't huge fans of animal testing. So he does talk about that. So I wanted to give them a heads up, as well as he uses the word hermaphrodite, which is not a word that I would use. I don't know if he's changed his lexicon yet, so I should find some more current videos about him just to see, because his presentation style is amazing. And this talk is about an hour and a half. And I did have students say, do I have to watch the whole thing? And I was like, okay, just give it a try because I bet you are. And that same student was like, oh my God, not only did I watch it, but I made my family watch it. Everybody watched it. It's like, yay, this is what we're trying to do, right? So trying to give them an idea of what's in the video, though, I think is a good idea. And then again, he's at UC Berkeley. So he's just up the road from us here in Oakland. And again, trying to increase the representation in the class by will also help to make the class more relatable, more comfortable, and things like that. It's really cool too, if you haven't looked him up yet. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about in class are some community building ideas. And this is where I'll talk about some of the ways I've learned stuff in a surprising manner, let's say. So I do have a meet your colleagues the first week. My department runs by consensus, as I mentioned on Wednesday. So we have community agreements in our department. So on their meet your colleagues page, I do have a video about myself. I tried to keep it to things like I went to community college before transferring to a four-year school. I'm dyslexic, right? So I understand struggles in school. I have one parent from Colombia, from another country. My other parent is a New Yorker, so which is, kind of some similar cultural differences in California. So growing up with two cultures, as well as a culture that was very different than either one of them had experienced in their lives, was a different way to grow up, or growing up with multiple languages in a home, things like that are things that I wanted to share with my students that I thought they could relate to. I struggle with that one a lot, about how much to share versus thinking that I'm taking too much space up in the room. So, doing what you're comfortable with, of course, and then kind of seeing how you feel. Then I gave them our community agreements for the biology department, and then asked them the question of, should we adopt these in our class? Right? Are there other things that we should use? I told them they could be creative, put a video, put images. And again, what this also kind of shows, I hope, is that I'm open to different ways of doing stuff. Right? So not only is it the actual words, but it's the intention behind the assignment that I think was appreciated by students. All of my discussions have these kind of what I think are clear, and again, I'll mention this in a second, directions and the purpose. And then I have a video on how to use the toolbar in Canvas. It was noted to me too, when I had my course evaluated, to also use the Canvas ones, the Canvas videos. And I haven't done that yet. So, but I will. So this is just one of them. The one though that I definitely learned, oh yeah, I have the grading rubric up there in the little 3 dots. I usually have a note on the page. But the one that I've learned a lot from are some of these conferences that I have. So I'm going to show you, this is my majors class. The first day kind of exercise in lab was a get to know you. And what I've had them do in this online environment is we use conferences, the big blue button, similar to Zoom, mainly because students can set up conferences with each other without me. You can also do this in Confer Zoom. A colleague of mine was talking about, like, you can make it and make one of the students a co-host so that they can just open it up. That works too. I just haven't tried it because I'm used to this format now. But what I had my students do is get into groups and then meet with each other without me, record it, right? And build these travel posters. I was trying to figure out a way to show the posters. I guess I could have if I'd taken their names up, because they are kind of cool. But listening to the conference was an excellent way to learn how students feel about the assignment. They know it's being recorded, right? They haven't said this to me in person. I would not recommend this if you're not okay with criticism, but it did allow me to hear what they really think, right? And it did lead me to change a lot of the directions that I have, and things I thought of as clear were not as clear, including this assignment, which my major students do formal lab write-ups. So I have them do a pre-lab. And so again, here's why we're doing a pre-lab. Here's the grading policy. I do point out to them that this is biology, so the format may be different than our physical science cousins, right? And what I'm asking you to do is this. And I get that one a lot in the sciences. Like, I took a scientific writing class and they told me this. It's like, okay, but in my class, I want you to do it this way. Then again, they make a conference where they meet with their pre-lab partner. This is the grading rubric that I use. I think of the grading rubrics more as ways that I'm suggesting to my students that they complete the assignment, as opposed to ways I'm going to grade it, if that makes sense, just so that they're familiar. I like to emphasize, in their pre-labs, things like integrating of words and the methods. This is my backgrounds tend to be pretty long, but I'm trying to get them to use the assignment. That sounds horrible. I'm trying to encourage them to use the assignment to really expand their knowledge about the material, right? Like, so it's not just you're doing this assignment, but use this as a way to try to concretize the information that led us to doing this. Now, in the conferences themselves, I have a format here on how to go through a peer review in a productive and supportive way. So this leads back to that kind of growth mindset versus fixed. So not this is what you did wrong on your pre-lab. This comes from kind of a feminist pedagogy perspective on how to do things like peer review. So the person whose pre-lab is being evaluated goes first and reviews 2 things they thought they did well. And then the reviewer says 2 things they thought that the author did well. And then how might they improve or expand? So it's not what did you do wrong, it's how could you expand on it. And one of the things I share with my students, again, is after they get their first formal lab back, then I say like, okay, so take the comments that I gave you and share it with each other, because you will end up in classes where, let's say your whole grade is dependent on a 25-page paper at the end of the semester that just says, write a paper about this topic. You're not going to get rubrics forever, right? You may not have approachable faculty that will answer questions about how they want things. So talk to each other about how things were done. And if that ends up complaining about me, that's fine, right? Go for it. I just want you to learn from each other. And so sometimes my directions can be a little vague, somewhat on purpose, because I'm hoping that it helps them to develop the skill. But I tell them that, right? I tell them this is vague on purpose because I want you all to talk to each other. And then I'm sure they roll their eyes, but it's, online. So maybe they don't. But the conferences, again, has been a way that I have really learned how they feel about the assignments, how they feel about the directions. Again, wouldn't recommend it if you're not okay with hearing those kinds of things. So don't listen to them if you're not in a good mood either. So, just a little word of warning. And lastly, I do have these group discussions. I'm going to keep this short so that I can make sure to get to something else. But this is my larger class, so about 50 people in the class. I broke them into 3 groups. This comes and goes in terms of students participating. It's really hard right now because everyone's so exhausted. But what I want to point out is the way we formatted this was to start off with something they felt good about answering, right? So what's something you feel comfortable answering? And then what's something, and here we put you would like help with, but I might change that language to something you would like someone else's opinion on or to expand on, right? So again, kind of shifting away from what's wrong, but more encouraging what's right. The other part about this, though, about community building that often we don't talk about in these seminars is ourselves. So how can we as a community, as a college, as a department, help to support each other in this process? Because it's not an easy process. It can be a challenge. Looking back at all the situations in my academic career where I felt unsupported by faculty or systems wasn't necessarily fun. It's not that it wasn't there, it just I didn't have to think about it so much. So building a community of support institutionally is another crucial aspect to this. There's a book called Teaching What You're Not, which is also really, and I'm happy to send folks a reference to that one as well. It's a collection of essays. And that's one of the things they talk about too, is building a community of support. So in my department, we have a shared Canvas sandbox. This is what the first page looks like. This is Lori. So thank you, Lori, for being the one that started to put this together. For instance, she found a great website that's got different images to increase representation in our classes. And then I know that we had some conversation about charts and Canvas and accessibility, but for us, this made sense. So what we're building out is each one of these links to a module with a whole bunch of different activities that we can share with each other. It's a kind of a more collectivist way of learning and of teaching where we can share activities with each other, maybe modify them. Lori and Riva had put together a bunch of these scientist spotlight ones. So if folks wanted to find people to put for that, prominent scientists using letting people talk about their research in their own words. We have some examples in our shell. We also at Laney started a STEM equity group. Some of us went to a conference in the fall and we continued to meet. We just meet once a month. And what we did this semester was each month, somebody kind of took a topic, like our math folks presented about the proficiency grading, as well as doing like one-on-one assistance with each other. In the fall, we talked about also doing things like maybe having a network where like, hey, does anyone feel like going for a walk right now? maybe smaller group support, one-on-one kind of mentoring with each other, or sharing with each other, especially as we move back to face-to-face for some of our stuff. And of course, for us STEM folks, being open to working with non-STEM people. So I got involved in equity class training because I took the class and was like, there weren't any STEM examples. So wonderful Chelsea was like, well, we're going to reevaluate the class. Why don't you come and join us? It's like, okay, excellent. Yes. But same, I wouldn't necessarily want a STEM specific equity training, because I definitely learned a great deal from working with our social science and our humanities and our other liberal arts and fine arts faculty. And I think we also have something to contribute on the science side as well. So working more collaboratively, I think, is a really great way to kind of review and help yourself through the process so that you're not necessarily alone in it. So with that, I will stop screen sharing, and I'm more than happy to answer questions. I know I just went over like 3 minutes, and I don't know how much time we still have, but I'm happy to, if we have any time, I'm happy to
So first of all,
answer.
let me say, Amy, oh my goodness, thank you. I've seen you give a similar presentation, and this is amazing. One of
Oh,
the things that
thanks.
was really spectacular on your slides was the examples and points. You did the little arrow thing on the left pointing out, and in a way you were actually demonstrating to us as your participants what students need, which is really clear, visual, highlighted directions and instructions. We do have another session at 9, but this has been so dense. I'm wondering, people could put questions in the chat, or would you mind if they just unmuted themselves and asked questions?
Totally, absolutely. And I don't want to keep anyone from the 9-1, but I'm happy to stick around if folks wanted to. Yeah.
And then lastly, would you be able to share like even a PDF version of your presentation slides with Kevin or myself or DDEM, and then we'll be able to either post that or something?
I can. Yeah. So I put the slides are in our equity, like our folder, our OneDrive folder. If you also, because I do have the references in the comments area, but I can do the other way too. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Amy. That was amazing.
Oh, thanks.
That was
Yay.
awesome. I've learned so much, and hopefully we can get together. I'd like to learn some more from you.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, yeah. It's always fun to kind of put some of these thoughts on paper, I guess you could say, like, yeah, like let's look at, and I have to say too, a lot of it, like I said, our STEM equity group at Laney that we've just started, it's been really interesting to talk to other folks about it. Definitely doing course evaluations with folks in STEM. Most of the ones I've done have been STEM, and that's been really interesting to see what other people are doing and sharing ideas and things, because again, Joanna Macy, right, says, yeah, trying to address anything alone is not the best way. You're not in it by yourself. So yeah, leaning on other people and learning from them at the same time. Yeah.
Amy, would you tell folks, because I think you mentioned it, but it went quickly, the collaborative resources your department has developed for all faculty?
Yeah, yeah. So one of the things we did because like many of the people probably in this room, I never thought I'd teach online, right? I thought, well, maybe when I retire, like I'll teach online. But when we all kind of had to, we developed as a department, we developed a Canvas shell with some activities and things like that, that we were all using as a way to kind of help each other out on this transition over. So for instance, we all do a microscope lab. So, here's how I'm doing the microscope lab. And if anyone wanted it, they could just upload. So when you build the sandbox, make sure people go in as instructors so that they can get the modules. And again, this was quite collaborative in the way that we were putting it together in the beginning. Interestingly, then in the beginning of this semester, when we changed the format, because it was getting kind of unmanageable, right? It was like, I don't know where anything is now. So we created that first page with the chart by class with some, kind of the list. And then we went back in and some folks were like, oh, I need to change. I changed that assignment. Let me fix it. It's not, it's better now. I would say too, my department, I wouldn't say competitive, but we could be kind of competitive with other people, like maybe not even with ourselves, but also trying to make sure that we're doing stuff in a way that is beneficial for students, and kind of always being maybe motivated. I'll say we're very motivated to try to be sure that we have good examples of things. And again, this is all of our departments, so part-time, full-time, classified staff, they're all in there so they can see kind of what's going on in our classes, and it's open to everybody. I also want to say, we just posted on our department page links to a bunch of webinars that we're all kind of watching, including SABRE, the Society for Biological Education and Research. So if you go to Laney / I guess I could put it in the chat too, biology, you'll see this new page about, some of these are about teaching, some are, or Stanford's Ryle, Race and Equity and Language and Education, I want to say. We put them all on our website. So
All right, Kevin just pointed out to me that we use the same Zoom room for the next session.
oh, okay.
So Amy, thank you so much for a really, really amazing presentation. And again, for those of you who want to connect with Amy,
I can do two things. I'll put the Laney website and so this is our department website. There's lots of resources on there. And then I don't mind, I'll put my email address.
oh, you're crazy, a little crazy there.
I know.
All right.
Oh, I just realized that this is going to be potentially public. Is this Zoom thing going to end up on a public space, Kevin?
Yes, we're going to
Okay.
put the videos on YouTube.
Okay, so then, well, I already put our department page, which has a link to, you can email us. We have a group, like a biology department group, and there's a link to our department, and I'm the one that you can send it to me that way. We'll put it that way.
You can also get a hold of Amy if you need to or get confused. Just email equity@peralta.edu. We'll connect.
True. And
All
actually,
right,
I
so
think,
I'm going to wrap it up because the next folks are going to be eagerly. Amy, thank you so
yes,
much, especially knowing you. Thank you for doing this at 8 in the morning. Yeah.
no problem. I know, right?